Arthur Cunningham stood in the doorway of the house he shared for nearly a decade, his hand gripping the edge of the door as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. On the walkway below, Tabitha Cunningham stood with their 9-year-old twins, Lucas holding her left hand, Lily clutching the sleeve of her coat. Neighbors watched from across the quiet Westchester street. "I'm sorry," Arthur said flatly, eyes cold with unfamiliar certainty. "But I don't know who you are, and you're not staying here." Tabitha didn't argue. She simply turned, gathered her children, and walked away from the home that had once been hers. Arthur didn't know it yet. The woman he had just cast out was weeks away from inheriting $200 million. And the truth about that morning would one day be read aloud in a courtroom. Before this story begins, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Stories like this travel across time zones, and it's always remarkable to see how far they reach. And if you believe dignity sometimes speaks loudest in silence, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Long before the morning when Tabitha Cunningham stood on the sidewalk with 2 small suitcases and her children beside her, people in Westchester County used to describe the Cunningham family with a single confident phrase. They looked perfect. The house alone made people say it. A restored colonial on a quiet tree-lined street in Scarsdale with tall windows and a wraparound porch that glowed warmly at night. Inside were polished wood floors, soft gray walls, and carefully chosen furniture that made the rooms feel both elegant and calm. Neighbors often saw Arthur Cunningham pulling his black SUV into the driveway just after sunset, stepping out in tailored suits that fit him as neatly as the life he appeared to lead. He had the posture of a man accustomed to being listened to. When he spoke, people leaned slightly closer. Arthur worked in commercial real estate development. His firm specialized in transforming neglected urban properties into profitable office complexes and residential towers. In industry circles, his name was associated with discipline, intelligence, and results. He spoke confidently about numbers, timelines, and investments. He rarely spoke about emotions. To outsiders, Arthur seemed like a man who had built everything himself. But inside the Cunningham home, there was another center of gravity, one far quieter: Tabitha Cunningham. At 37, Tabitha had a calm presence that many people overlooked until they spent time with her. She moved through rooms gently, almost deliberately, as if she were always aware of how small actions shaped larger outcomes. Before her children were born, she had worked as an archival researcher for a Sanastra historical documentation nonprofit in New York City. Her job involved cataloging letters, diaries, and original records from the 19th and early 20th centuries. She had spent years reading the private thoughts of strangers long gone. Perhaps that was why she developed the habit that would later matter more than anyone realized. Tabitha wrote things down, not dramatically, not obsessively, but carefully. A small leather notebook usually sat inside her bag. In it, she recorded ordinary details: dates, appointments, school schedules, phone calls, brief descriptions of conversations. To her, documentation was simply a way to keep life organized. She never imagined those notes would one day become a quiet record of a marriage slowly changing shape. When Lucas and Lily Cunningham were born, the house grew louder and warmer. The twins arrived 5 minutes apart on a bright May afternoon and quickly developed personalities that made them impossible to confuse. Lucas was thoughtful and observant. He asked questions adults sometimes struggled to answer. Lily was energetic, curious, and fearless about speaking her mind. At 9 years old, they shared the same dark hair as their mother and their father's sharp blue eyes. They also shared something else, a sensitivity to the emotional climate around them. Children often understand more than adults believe. At first, the Cunningham marriage looked exactly like the one people admired from the outside. Arthur attended school events when his schedule allowed. Tabitha volunteered at the library and helped coordinate neighborhood fundraisers. Holiday photos showed the family standing together on snowy front steps or sitting near the fireplace with mugs of cocoa. But perfection rarely dissolves all at once. It fades gradually, almost politely. Arthur's career grew rapidly during the years after the twins were born. Promotions came with longer hours, larger projects, and a widening circle of professional relationships. With success came a subtle shift in how he viewed the structure of his life. In Arthur's mind, he had become the primary architect of the family's stability. The mortgage, the investments, the private school tuition, all of it, he believed, rested on the strength of his decisions. Tabitha never argued about that. She simply continued managing the quiet infrastructure of daily life meals, school forms, doctor appointments, birthday parties, household finances, and the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept a family functioning smoothly. Arthur rarely noticed how much work it took. Instead, he sometimes spoke to her with a tone that was almost casual in its dismissal. "You're lucky you don't have to deal with the stress I do," he said once while scanning emails during dinner. Tabitha had written the date of that conversation in her notebook later that night, not because it was unusual, but because it wasn't. Over time, small comments accumulated. None of them were explosive. None would have shocked an outsider, but together they formed a pattern that Tabitha quietly observed. Arthur began making more financial decisions without discussing them. He restructured investment accounts. He opened new corporate partnerships. Tabitha didn't challenge him. She simply asked occasional practical questions and saved copies of the paperwork that passed through the house. Around that same period, a new figure began appearing in Arthur's professional orbit. Her name was Vanessa Whitmore. Vanessa worked as a strategic consultant for the development firm that partnered with Arthur's company on several large projects in Manhattan. She was known in industry circles for her ability to analyze market trends quickly and position investors ahead of competitors. She was also known for something else. Vanessa was exceptionally good at recognizing ambition in other people and aligning herself with it. Arthur first mentioned her casually at dinner one evening. Whitmore from the consulting group came up with a strategy that saved the project months, he said. Sharp mind. Tabitha nodded politely. Later that week, Vanessa's name appeared again. Then again. Eventually, she became a regular part of Arthur's stories about work. Tabitha met her once at a corporate holiday gathering. Vanessa was elegant, confident, and effortlessly charming in conversation. Her compliments toward Arthur sounded genuine, but carefully measured. "You're lucky to work with someone who sees the bigger picture," Vanessa told Tabitha with a polite smile. Wasn't an insult, but it also wasn't a compliment. Tabitha noticed that too, and she wrote Vanessa Whitmore's name in her notebook that night for the first time. Meanwhile, another story existed quietly in the background of Tabitha's life, one that almost no one in Westchester discussed. Her family history. Tabitha's mother had grown up in Boston as the daughter of a powerful investor named Richard Langston. For decades, Langston's name appeared in financial publications associated with early technology investments and venture capital funds. But Tabitha rarely spoke about him. Years earlier, her mother had chosen to distance herself from the Langston family after disagreements about control expectations and the direction of her life. The separation had been quiet but permanent. By the time Tabitha married Arthur, her connection to that branch of the family had faded into something that felt almost historical. Arthur knew the name, but he treated it like a footnote. To him, Richard Langston was simply an aging financier somewhere in Boston whose fortune had nothing to do with the Cunningham household. And for many years, that assumption appeared completely accurate. Tabitha lived a modest life compared to the scale of the Langston empire. She raised her children, she organized school schedules, she cooked dinners, she kept records, and she watched. Not with suspicion, not with resentment, but with the patient attention of someone who understood something many people ignored. The truth about relationships often reveals itself slowly through patterns that only become visible when someone is willing to notice them. Tabitha noticed everything. What she didn't know yet was how important those observations would become. Because somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Westchester, events were already unfolding that would reshape the Cunningham family in ways none of them could imagine. Within a few months, a rainy night on Interstate 95 would shatter Arthur Cunningham's memory. Within a few weeks after that, the door of the Cunningham home would close behind Tabitha and her children. And within a short time after that, a lawyer in Boston would open a document that changed the balance of power in the entire story. But on this earlier evening, before the accident, before the exile, before the courtroom records existed, the Cunningham house still glowed warmly under the porch lights. Inside, Tabitha Cunningham sat at the kitchen table. Her notebook lay open beside her, and she continued writing. The night of the crash began quietly, the way many turning points do. Nothing about the evening suggested that it would divide the Cunningham family's life into two clear eras, before and after. Rain had started falling just after sunset, a steady spring storm that blurred the streetlights along the quiet roads of Westchester County. Inside the Cunningham house, the windows reflected the warm glow of the kitchen lamps. Tabitha Cunningham stood at the counter finishing the last of the dishes, while Lucas and Lily worked on homework at the dining table. Lucas was reading aloud from a science workbook, his voice careful and deliberate. "The Earth rotates once every 24 hours, he said, pausing to sound out a longer word. Lily leaned over his shoulder. "That's wrong," she whispered. "It's not wrong. You skipped a line." Lucas frowned and looked again. She was right. Tabitha heard the small exchange and smiled faintly without turning around. Ordinary sounds, ordinary moments. The kind people assume will repeat forever. Arthur Cunningham arrived home a little later than usual that evening. The sound of his car pulling into the driveway reached the kitchen through the rain. Lucas glanced toward the window. Dad's home. The front door opened a moment later. Arthur stepped inside his suit jacket damp with rain, his expression already tired in the way it often was after long meetings. He loosened his tie as he walked into the kitchen. "Evening," he said. Tabitha dried her hands and turned. "Dinner's still warm." Arthur nodded, but didn't sit immediately. Instead, he reached for his phone, scanning messages with quick, practiced movements. Lucas and Lily watched him from the table. "Dad," Lily said suddenly, "we're doing a solar system project next week." Arthur looked up briefly. "That's good. You said you'd help me build the model." Arthur hesitated just long enough for the pause to register. "We'll see what my schedule looks like." Lily didn't argue. She simply returned to her notebook. Tabitha placed a plate in front of Arthur. He sat down and began eating while reading emails, barely noticing the quiet conversation between the twins. After several minutes, he spoke again. "There was a reception tonight for the Midtown project," he said without looking up. Tabitha nodded. "How did it go? Productive?" He scrolled through his phone again. Vanessa Whitmore presented a new redevelopment plan for the Riverside property. Investors liked it. Tabitha recognized the name immediately. Vanessa Whitmore. Arthur had mentioned her many times during the past year. Each time his tone carried the same mix of professional respect and subtle admiration. "She's sharp." Arthur continued. "Understands the numbers better than most of the board." Tabitha took a seat across from him. "That's good for the project." Arthur finally looked up, studying her expression briefly. "You never say much when I talk about work." Tabitha tilted her head slightly. "I listen." Arthur gave a short, distracted laugh. "Yes, you do." The comment sounded neutral, but something inside it carried the faint edge of dismissal that had become familiar over the years. Dinner continued in relative silence. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. When the meal ended, Arthur stood and placed his plate in the sink. "I have to head back out," he said. Tabitha glanced at the clock. "It's almost 9. Investors are in town." Vanessa set up a late meeting downtown. Lucas looked up from the table. "Are you coming back tonight?" Arthur hesitated again. "Yes." The word came quickly, but not convincingly. Tabitha didn't challenge him. She simply nodded. "Drive carefully. The roads are slick." Arthur grabbed his keys from the counter. I always do. The door closed behind him a moment later. Through the window, Tabitha watched the headlights of his car disappear into the rain. She didn't feel angry, not exactly. But something about the evening lingered in her mind, the way certain moments do when they carry a weight that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. After the twins went upstairs to brush their teeth, Tabitha sat at the kitchen table with her notebook. She wrote a short entry, April 17th. Arthur leaving again for meeting with Vanessa. Late. Heavy rain tonight. The note took less than 20 seconds. Then she closed the notebook. Arthur Cunningham drove south toward Manhattan with the windshield wipers moving in a steady rhythm. Traffic along Interstate 95 was thinner than usual because of the weather. Sheets of rain reduced visibility, turning the highway into a ribbon of reflected headlights and blurred taillights. Arthur had always considered himself a confident driver. But that night, his attention was divided. His phone buzzed in the center console. A message from Vanessa Whitmore. Running a little late. Meet at the restaurant near the river instead. Arthur glanced at the screen. Just for a second. It was enough. When he looked back at the road, the red brake lights ahead of him were suddenly much closer than they had been a moment earlier. He hit the brakes hard. The tires lost traction on the wet pavement. The SUV swerved sideways. For an instant, the world seemed to tilt the highway, sliding past the windows at an impossible angle. Then came the sound. Metal striking concrete, glass breaking. A violent impact that erased the careful order of Arthur Cunningham's life in a single brutal moment. The next thing Arthur knew, bright white lights hung above him. Voices moved around the edges of his awareness. Blood pressure stabilizing. Possible head trauma. Prepare imaging. Arthur tried to move, but a heavy pressure wrapped around his head and shoulders. A face leaned into view. A man in a white coat. "I'm Dr. Stephen Caldwell," the man said calmly. "You've been in a car accident, Mr. Cunningham. You're in New York Presbyterian Hospital." Arthur blinked slowly. Fragments of thought floated through his mind. His office, his company, buildings he had developed. But something felt wrong, as if pieces of the timeline between those memories were missing. "Your wife is on her way," Dr. Caldwell continued. Arthur frowned. What? The call from the hospital reached Tabitha just after midnight. A police officer explained the situation in careful, controlled language. There had been an accident on Interstate 95. Arthur was alive, but he had suffered a head injury and had been transported to New York Presbyterian. Tabitha listened without interrupting. After the call ended, she stood very still in the kitchen for several seconds. Then she went upstairs. Lucas and Lily were asleep. She woke her friend, Megan Brooks, who lived 3 streets away. Megan arrived 20 minutes later, wearing a coat over her pajamas. "I'll stay with them," Megan said quietly. Tabitha nodded and grabbed her keys. The rain had not stopped. The hospital corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm air from the ventilation system. Tabitha followed a nurse down a long hallway until they reached a private room. Arthur lay in the bed with a bandage across his forehead and a monitor quietly tracking his heartbeat. Dr. Caldwell stood beside the bed, reviewing a tablet. "You're Mrs. Cunningham?" "Yes." The doctor spoke carefully. "Your husband experienced a traumatic brain injury. The good news is that the scans show no life-threatening bleeding." Tabitha felt her shoulders loosen slightly. "But there is another concern," the doctor continued. "Arthur appears to be experiencing retrograde amnesia." Tabitha absorbed the term silently. "He remembers his career doctor," Caldwell said. "He remembers certain earlier periods of his life. But memories from the past decade appear fragmented or distorted." Tabitha looked at Arthur. His eyes opened slowly. For a moment, he simply stared at her. Confusion crossed his face. Not hostility, not anger, just unfamiliarity. "Who are you?" he asked. The question hung in the quiet hospital room like something fragile and dangerous. Tabitha didn't answer immediately. She watched him carefully, as if trying to determine whether the man in the hospital bed was truly lost inside his own mind, or if the story of his memory had only begun to change. Somewhere outside, the storm continued moving north along the coast. Inside the hospital room, the first crack in the Cunningham family's future had already begun to widen. The first days after Arthur Cunningham woke in the hospital moved slowly, as if time itself had become cautious. Machines hummed quietly in the background. Nurses stepped in and out of the room with practiced calm. Outside the tall windows of New York Presbyterian Hospital, the city continued its usual rhythm traffic, flowing along the river helicopters crossing the skyline, commuters moving through lives that had not been interrupted. Inside Arthur's hospital room, however, something fundamental had shifted. Dr. Stephen Caldwell explained the condition carefully during the second morning after the accident. Retrograde amnesia doesn't erase a life completely, he said. What we often see instead is a disruption of the timeline. Some memories remain intact. Others are fragmented. Some may return over time. Arthur listened, his brow slightly furrowed. And some may not, he asked. That's possible. Arthur glanced toward the window. So what exactly do I remember, Doctor? Caldwell answered methodically. You remember your education, your career history, your business partners. Most events from before roughly 10 or 11 years ago. Arthur nodded slowly. Then his eyes moved toward Tabitha, who sat quietly in the chair beside the hospital bed. And the things I don't remember, he asked. Dr. Caldwell followed his gaze. You appear to have difficulty recalling your marriage and the years since your children were born. The words settled into the room with uncomfortable weight. Arthur studied Tabitha again as if hoping recognition might suddenly appear. It didn't. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice calm but distant. I don't mean to be rude. I just don't feel anything familiar. Tabitha didn't react dramatically. She simply inclined her head slightly. That's what the doctor explained. Arthur seemed relieved by her composure. Dr. Caldwell continued outlining the recovery plan. Emotional stability is extremely important during the next few weeks. Too much pressure to remember things can create stress that slows neurological recovery. Arthur nodded. So I shouldn't force it. Exactly. The doctor turned to Tabitha. Familiar environments can help. Returning home gradually may stimulate natural memory pathways. Tabitha listened carefully. Home. The word sounded simple, but she already sensed that returning there might not restore the life that had existed before. Arthur remained in the hospital for another week while doctors monitored swelling in his brain and evaluated his cognitive function. During that time, visitors came and went. Business associates, members of his development firm, several investors who wanted reassurance that their projects would continue moving forward. Arthur spoke easily with them. He remembered their names, their companies, the deals they had worked on together. Those memories remained perfectly intact. But whenever conversations drifted toward his family, something changed. He grew quiet, uncertain. One afternoon, Lucas and Lily visited with Megan Brooks. The twins entered the room cautiously, holding each other's hands. Arthur looked at them with polite curiosity. Hello, he said gently. Lucas stopped near the foot of the bed. Hi, Dad. Arthur blinked. The word landed strangely in his mind. He knew intellectually that he had children. Dr. Caldwell had explained that already. But hearing the title spoken by a small boy with familiar blue eyes created an unsettling disconnection between knowledge and feeling. Hi, Arthur replied carefully. Lily stepped closer. We brought your drawing from the refrigerator, she said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. Arthur studied the picture. A stick figure family standing beside a house under a yellow sun. 4 figures, 2 adults, 2 children. He understood what the drawing meant, but the emotional recognition that should have followed remained absent. That's nice, he said. The twins exchanged a glance. They were old enough to sense something was wrong, but too young to understand exactly what had been taken away. Tabitha watched quietly from the corner of the room. She didn't push Arthur to respond differently. She simply observed. And later that night, when she returned home, she wrote the date and details of the visit in her notebook. The next visitor arrived 2 days later. Vanessa Whitmore. Unlike most of Arthur's colleagues, Vanessa walked into the hospital room with confident familiarity. She wore a tailored navy coat and carried a small bouquet of white orchids. "Arthur," she said warmly, stepping closer to the bed. "You look much better than the doctors made it sound." Arthur studied her face. This time, recognition flickered almost immediately. Vanessa. Her smile widened. "See, some memories survived." Tabitha stood quietly near the window. Vanessa glanced toward her briefly. "Oh," she said politely. "You must be Tabitha." Tabitha nodded. Vanessa turned her attention back to Arthur almost immediately. "We've been managing the Riverside project while you've been recovering," she said. The investors were worried, but I reassured them. Arthur relaxed slightly. "Good." Vanessa pulled a chair closer. "You should focus on getting better. The business side is under control." Her tone carried an ease that suggested long familiarity. Arthur looked grateful. For the first time since the accident, someone in the room spoke to him about the part of his life he still recognized. Tabitha noticed the shift immediately. Vanessa spoke for nearly 30 minutes, discussing development schedules, financing strategies, and upcoming meetings. Arthur followed every detail with ease. When Vanessa finally stood to leave, she placed the orchids on the bedside table. "Call me if you need anything," she said. Arthur nodded. "Thank you for coming." Vanessa paused near the door and looked back at him thoughtfully. "Don't worry about the rest," she added gently. "Sometimes memories return more easily when you're not surrounded by pressure." Arthur seemed relieved by the comment. After she left, the room grew quiet again. Arthur glanced at Tabitha. "She seems helpful." Tabitha considered the statement for a moment. "Yes," she said simply. Arthur was discharged from the hospital 4 days later. Dr. Caldwell repeated the same advice before he left. A calm environment, familiar surroundings, gradual reintroduction to routine. Arthur agreed. But the idea of returning home with a wife he didn't remember and children who felt like strangers unsettled him in ways he struggled to explain. Vanessa provided a different perspective during a phone call that evening. "Arthur, listen," she said carefully. "You shouldn't rush yourself. If things feel overwhelming at home, you're allowed to set boundaries." Arthur leaned back in the passenger seat of the car that was driving him home. "I just don't want to make things worse." "You won't," Vanessa replied. "You're recovering from a brain injury. Everyone needs to understand that." Arthur nodded slowly. The words gave him a sense of justification he hadn't fully realized he was searching for. When the car finally pulled into the driveway of the Cunningham house in Scarsdale, the porch lights were already on. Tabitha stood inside the doorway. Lucas and Lily waited behind her. Arthur stepped out of the car and looked at the house. Something about it felt familiar, but the people standing inside it did none, and now not. He walked toward the door slowly. Tabitha opened it. "Welcome home," she said. Arthur stepped inside. For a brief moment, he studied the living room. The furniture, the framed photographs on the walls, the small details of a life built over years. Some of the images showed him standing beside Tabitha, holding Lucas and Lily as babies, smiling at birthdays and holidays. He recognized himself in the photos, but the emotional connection to the memories they represented still refused to surface. Arthur turned toward Tabitha. "I'm going to need some time," he said quietly. Tabitha met his gaze. "I know." Arthur nodded, relieved again by her calm response. But what neither of them fully understood yet was how quickly that need for space would begin to reshape the structure of the Cunningham home. Because somewhere beyond the quiet rooms of the house, another voice had already begun filling the empty spaces inside Arthur's memory. And that voice belonged to Vanessa Whitmore. The Cunningham house had not changed. The same oak floors stretched through the hallway. The same framed photographs still lined the staircase. the same faint scent of coffee drifted through the kitchen every morning. But Arthur Cunningham moved through the rooms as if he were visiting a place someone else once lived in. For the first few days after returning from the hospital, everything remained quiet and careful. Tabitha kept the house calm, just as Dr. Caldwell had recommended. Lucas and Lily lowered their voices without being asked. They watched their father cautiously, as if sudden movements might make him disappear again. Arthur appreciated the silence. It gave him space to think, but it also created distance. On the fourth morning after he came home, Arthur stood in the kitchen, studying the refrigerator. Magnets held up drawings, school calendars, and photographs taken during vacations he could not remember. One photo showed him kneeling in the sand on a beach, Lily sitting on his shoulders, while Lucas held a plastic shovel. Arthur stared at the image. He could recognize the person in the picture, but he could not recognize the life it represented. Behind him, Tabitha poured coffee into 2 cups. "Your therapy appointment is at 10, she said gently. "Dr. Caldwell wants to monitor how you're adjusting." Arthur nodded. "Right." He hesitated before speaking again. "I might stop by the office afterward." Tabitha didn't object. "That's fine." Arthur studied her expression. "You're very calm about all this." Tabitha placed the coffee mug in front of him. "What would you prefer?" Arthur frowned slightly. "I don't know." He paused. "Maybe someone who's more emotional." Tabitha sat across from him. "You're recovering from a brain injury," she said simply. Anger wouldn't make that easier. Arthur looked at her carefully, as if trying to determine whether her calmness meant acceptance or something else. Before he could ask anything further, the front doorbell rang. Arthur glanced toward the hallway. Expecting someone, Tabitha shook her head. "I'll see who it is." She walked to the door and opened it. Vanessa Whitmore stood on the porch. Her expression brightened immediately when she saw Arthur behind Tabitha. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Vanessa said warmly. "I was in the neighborhood after a meeting and thought I'd check in." Arthur stepped forward. "Vanessa." She gave him a quick, relieved smile. "You look much better than the last time I saw you." Vanessa carried a slim leather portfolio under her arm. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" she asked. Tabitha stepped aside politely. "Of course." Vanessa entered the house with the ease of someone already familiar with its layout. She followed Arthur into the living room and placed the portfolio on the coffee table. "I brought some project summaries," she said. "Nothing urgent, but I thought you might want to see how things are moving." Arthur sat down. "Thanks." Vanessa flipped open the portfolio and began explaining timelines, investor expectations, and financial projections. Arthur listened closely. For the first time since returning home, he appeared completely engaged. Business still made sense to him. Numbers still followed logical patterns. Tabitha stood quietly near the doorway observing. Vanessa spoke for nearly 40 minutes. During that time, Lucas and Lily returned from the backyard and stepped into the room. They stopped when they saw the unfamiliar woman sitting beside their father. Vanessa glanced at them briefly. "Oh, you must be the kids," she said politely. Lily looked uncertain. "Yes." Lucas nodded, but said nothing. Vanessa turned back to Arthur quickly. "As I was saying, the Riverside investors are pushing to finalize the financing structure before summer." Arthur nodded. "Right." The twins exchanged a glance and quietly left the room again. Tabitha watched them go. Later that evening, after Vanessa had left, Lucas approached his mother in the kitchen. "Who was that?" he asked. "Someone who works with your dad." Lucas thought about that answer carefully. She talked to him like she knew him better than we do. Tabitha didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed a plate in the dishwasher and closed the door. "Sometimes people know different parts of the same person," she said. Lucas wasn't sure he understood, but he nodded anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, Vanessa began appearing at the house more often. At first, the visits seemed practical. She delivered paperwork from the office. She helped Arthur review project contracts. She offered to coordinate meetings while he continued recovering. Arthur appreciated the help. "You've basically been running the place while I've been gone," he told her one afternoon. Vanessa shrugged modestly. Someone had to keep things moving. She glanced briefly toward the kitchen where Tabitha stood. Not everyone understands how complicated your business is. The comment sounded harmless, but the implication lingered in the air. Arthur didn't challenge it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. I'm glad you're here. Vanessa smiled slightly. For Tabitha, the pattern became clear quickly. Vanessa wasn't just assisting Arthur's recovery. She was shaping the narrative of his memory. Each conversation subtly redefined the past. According to Vanessa's version of events, Arthur had been under tremendous pressure before the accident. The marriage had already been strained. Tabitha had not always understood the demands of Arthur's career. None of the statements were openly hostile. But together, they formed a new story, and Arthur, without memories to contradict it, began accepting that story as truth. One evening, Tabitha stood near the hallway as she overheard part of a conversation between Arthur and Vanessa in the living room. You don't have to rush back into everything Vanessa was saying. Arthur sighed. I just don't want unnecessary stress right now. Vanessa nodded sympathetically. Exactly. Dr. Caldwell said stability is important. She lowered her voice slightly. If certain situations feel emotionally complicated, you're allowed to set boundaries. Arthur leaned forward. You mean with Tabitha? Vanessa hesitated just long enough to make the suggestion feel reluctant. I'm just saying you should prioritize your recovery. Arthur looked thoughtful. Tabitha stepped quietly back into the kitchen before they noticed her. A few minutes later, she opened her notebook. She wrote the date. Then she recorded the conversation almost word for word, not because she wanted to prove anything, but because documentation had always been part of how she understood the world. The shift happened gradually. Arthur began spending more time in his home office, reviewing business files with Vanessa. Meals became shorter. Conversations between Arthur and Tabitha became less frequent. Lucas and Lily sensed the change most clearly. Their father still spoke to them politely, but the instinctive warmth they remembered from before the accident never returned. One afternoon, Lily asked a question that lingered in the quiet house long after she said it. Mom. Yes. Do you think Dad will remember us again? Tabitha knelt beside her daughter. I don't know, she said honestly. Lily looked down at the floor. What if he doesn't want to? Tabitha gently tucked a strand of hair behind Lily's ear. Sometimes people make decisions when they're confused, she said. And sometimes those decisions show who they really are. Lily didn't fully understand. But the calm certainty in her mother's voice reassured her. 3 days later, Arthur made a decision. It happened on a clear afternoon in the living room. Vanessa sat beside him, reviewing financial documents. Tabitha stood near the doorway after finishing a phone call. Arthur looked up. Tabitha, can we talk? She stepped into the room. Of course. Arthur hesitated before speaking. I've been thinking about what's best for my recovery. Tabitha waited. Arthur exhaled slowly. I think it would be easier if things were less complicated here for a while. Vanessa remained silent beside him. Arthur continued. Maybe you and the kids could stay somewhere else for a bit. The words hung in the air like something irreversible. Tabitha looked at him carefully. You want us to leave the house? Arthur nodded. Just temporarily. Lucas and Lily stood at the end of the hallway listening. Tabitha noticed them immediately, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply asked one quiet question. Where would the children sleep tonight? Arthur looked uncomfortable. I'm sure you can figure something out. The calmness of the statement made the moment heavier than anger ever could. Tabitha held his gaze for a few seconds longer. Then she nodded. All right. Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair but said nothing. Within an hour, 2 small suitcases stood by the front door. Lucas held his sister's hand. Arthur remained near the living room window. Tabitha opened the door. Cool evening air drifted into the house. She stepped outside with her children, and behind them, the door of the Cunningham home closed. The motel room was smaller than anything Lucas and Lily had ever slept in before. A single window faced the parking lot where rows of cars sat beneath yellow streetlights. The hum of a soda machine near the office drifted faintly through the night air. Inside the room, two narrow beds stood against opposite walls separated by a small wooden table and a lamp with a cracked base. The sign outside read, White Plains Motor Lodge. Tabitha Cunningham had chosen it for one simple reason. It was clean. Lucas sat cross-legged on one of the beds, while Lily stood near the window, watching headlights pass along the road beyond the parking lot. Neither of them complained. Children often understand when something serious has happened, even if no one explains it fully. Tabitha set their small suitcases on the dresser and began unpacking with quiet efficiency. To anyone watching from the outside, she might have looked like a traveler settling into a temporary stop. But inside her mind, she was already reorganizing the next stage of their lives. Mom, Lucas said softly after a while. Yes. Are we going back home tomorrow? Tabitha paused for half a second before folding another shirt. I don't know yet. Lucas nodded slowly. He didn't press further. Lily turned away from the window. Dad really didn't want us there. The statement was simple. There was no accusation in her voice, just observation. Tabitha walked over and sat beside her daughter. Your father is confused right now, she said gently. Lily studied her mother's face. Confused people don't usually tell kids to leave. Tabitha didn't answer that immediately. Instead, she brushed a strand of hair away from Lily's eyes. Sometimes people make decisions when they're scared, she said. Even if those decisions hurt other people. Lily leaned against her shoulder. Lucas remained on the bed staring at the patterned carpet. The motel room fell quiet. After the twins finally went to sleep, Tabitha sat alone at the small table beneath the lamp. Her notebook lay open in front of her. She wrote slowly, carefully, April 29th. Arthur asked us to leave the house. Vanessa present. Lucas and Lily witnessed. No discussion about arrangements for the children. The words looked calm on the page, but they carried the weight of a turning point. Tabitha closed the notebook. Then she opened her laptop. One by one, she began organizing files. Emails from Arthur, bank notifications, digital copies of financial documents, calendar entries. She saved them into labeled folders. It was the same quiet habit she had developed years earlier while working with historical archives. Preserve the record, because the record eventually speaks. The next morning began earlier than usual. Lucas woke before sunrise and sat by the window watching delivery trucks move through the parking lot. Tabitha noticed him awake when she stepped out of the bathroom. Couldn't sleep. Lucas shrugged. I kept thinking about the house. Tabitha poured cereal into 3 small bowls. We'll figure things out one step at a time. Lucas nodded. He trusted that answer more than dramatic promises. Lily woke shortly afterward, still wrapped in the motel blanket. They ate breakfast quietly. Afterward, Tabitha walked them to the small playground behind the motel while she made phone calls. First, she contacted the twins' school to explain that they would miss a few days. Then she called Megan Brooks. Megan answered immediately. I was wondering when you'd call, she said. How are the kids? They're holding up. And you? Tabitha glanced across the playground where Lucas pushed Lily gently on a swing. I'm working on the next steps. Megan hesitated. Arthur really told you to leave? Yes. A brief silence followed. That's unbelievable. Tabitha didn't comment. Megan exhaled slowly. You can stay with me if you want. I appreciate it, Tabitha said. But I think a neutral place is better right now. Neutral, less complicated. Megan understood what she meant. Sometimes space allowed people to think more clearly. Still, her voice softened. Call me if you need anything. I will. After the call ended, Tabitha watched her children play for several minutes before returning to the room. That was when her phone rang again. The number displayed a Boston area code. Tabitha answered. "Hello." A calm, professional voice responded. "Good morning. May I speak with Tabitha Cunningham?" "This is she. My name is Daniel Pike. I'm an attorney with Henderson & Pike, LLP in Boston." Tabitha sat down slowly. "Yes, I'm calling regarding the estate of Mr. Richard Langston." The name landed in the room with quiet gravity. Richard Langston. Tabitha's grandfather. A man she had not spoken to in more than a decade. "I see," she said carefully. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Langston passed away 2 days ago." Tabitha closed her eyes briefly. Even though their relationship had been distant, the news still carried weight. "I understand. There are several matters concerning his will that require your presence," Daniel Pike continued. "You are listed as a primary beneficiary." Tabitha remained silent for a moment. "Primary beneficiary," she repeated. "Yes." The lawyer's tone remained professional but measured. "Mr. Langston's estate is substantial. Certain documents must be reviewed in person before distribution procedures can begin." Tabitha looked around the small motel room. The contrast between her current surroundings and the lawyer's words felt almost surreal. "When would you need me in Boston, preferably within the next few days?" Daniel Pike paused. "There are financial structures involved that will require explanation." Tabitha considered the logistics quickly. "I have 2 children with me. That's perfectly fine. We can schedule the meeting around your availability." She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "All right. I'll send you the details shortly," Pike said. "And again, Miss Cunningham, I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you." The call ended. For a moment, Tabitha simply sat in silence. Then she opened her laptop again. A new email arrived seconds later. Subject estate of Richard Langston. Appointment confirmation attached were several legal documents and a meeting time scheduled for 2 days later. Tabitha read through the email carefully. Her expression didn't change. She closed the computer and walked outside. Lucas and Lily were still at the playground. Lily spotted her first. "Mom." She jumped off the swing and ran over. "Can we get ice cream later?" Tabitha smiled faintly. "Maybe." Lucas approached more slowly. Who called Tabitha looked at both of them. A lawyer in Boston. Lucas frowned. Why she knelt, so that they were eye level. "Your great-grandfather passed away." The twins exchanged surprised looks. They had heard the name before, but had never met him. "Did he leave something for us?" Lily asked. Tabitha hesitated. "Possibly." Lucas tilted his head. What kind of something Tabitha thought about the email she had just read? About the words primary beneficiary? About the tone in the lawyer's voice? "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but we'll find out soon." The twins accepted the answer easily. For them, the bigger mystery still revolved around their father. But as the 3 of them walked back toward the motel room, another story had quietly begun, unfolding one that stretched far beyond the small parking lot and the humming soda machine outside. In Boston, inside a law firm overlooking the harbor, a sealed document waited in a conference room. A document that would soon reveal that Tabitha Cunningham, currently living in a roadside motel with 2 small suitcases and 2 tired children, was about to inherit something very few people on Earth ever did: $200 million. And when that information finally reached Arthur Cunningham, the man who had closed his door to his family, the meaning of the past few weeks would look very different. But for now, Tabitha simply unlocked the motel room door and continued planning the next step. 2 days later, Tabitha Cunningham drove north toward Boston with Lucas and Lily in the back seat. The morning sky was pale gray, the kind that seemed undecided between rain and sunlight. Traffic along Interstate 95 moved steadily past stretches of bare trees and early spring grass just beginning to turn green. Lucas watched the road signs as they passed. "Is Boston far?" he asked. "About 3 hours," Tabitha replied. Lily leaned against the window. "Have you been there before?" Tabitha nodded slightly. "Once. A long time ago." She didn't elaborate. Some histories were easier to leave folded in the past. The twins didn't push for more details. They had learned over the past week that their mother's quiet answers often meant there was more beneath the surface than she was ready to explain. By late morning, the skyline of Boston appeared beyond the harbor glass towers rising above the older brick buildings near the waterfront. Tabitha parked in a small garage beside a stone office building overlooking the water. The sign near the entrance read, "Henderson and Pike, LLP." Lucas stared up at the building. "This is a lawyer's office." "Yes. Why would great-grandpa's lawyer need to see you?" Tabitha rested a hand gently on his shoulder. "We're about to find out." Inside the building lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. A receptionist directed them to the 15th floor, where a quiet hallway led to a large conference room with tall windows facing the harbor. A man in his early 50s stood when they entered. "Miss Cunningham," he said warmly. He extended his hand. "Daniel Pike." Tabitha shook it. "Thank you for meeting with us." Pike smiled at the twins. "And you must be Lucas and Lily." They nodded politely. "Feel free to sit wherever you like," Pike said, gesturing toward the long table. The room felt large and formal compared to the motel they had left that morning. A tray with water glasses and coffee sat on one side of the table. A thick folder rested neatly in front of Pike. Tabitha noticed immediately that it wasn't the only one. 3 additional folders sat stacked beside it. She sat down slowly. Daniel Pike folded his hands. "First, let me express my condolences for your grandfather's passing." Tabitha inclined her head. "Thank you. Richard Langston was a remarkable man," Pike continued. "He built one of the earliest venture capital funds focused on technology startups in the late 1980s. Many companies that exist today began with investments from his firm." Tabitha had heard parts of that story growing up, but her mother rarely spoke about the details. "What you may not know," Pike added, "is that Mr. Langston maintained a very close watch on your life over the past 15 years. Tabitha looked up. "Excuse me." Pike slid one of the folders toward her. "Your grandfather regretted the distance that developed between him and your mother. He understood the decisions she made, but he still cared deeply about his family." Tabitha opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of letters, school records, newspaper clippings, even photographs of Lucas and Lily from charity events and school activities. Her grandfather had been following her life quietly, without ever reaching out. Pike continued. He believed that reconnecting directly might cause complications. Instead, he asked our firm to keep him informed. Lucas leaned closer to look at the documents. "Great-grandpa knew about us." "Yes," Pike said gently. "He knew quite a lot." Lily looked surprised. "Why didn't he come visit Pike?" Hesitated. "Your great-grandfather was a complicated man," he said carefully. Tabitha closed the folder. "I see." Daniel Pike nodded and pulled the top document from the stack beside him. "This is Mr. Langston's final will and testament." The paper looked simple, but the weight of it filled the room. Pike adjusted his glasses and began speaking. Several charitable donations are outlined here. Universities, medical research foundations, and community organizations in Boston. He paused. However, the majority of the estate is directed to a family trust. Tabitha waited. Pike looked directly at her. "That trust names you, Tabitha Cunningham, as the primary beneficiary." Lucas blinked. "What does that mean?" Pike offered a small smile. "It means your mother will oversee the assets." Tabitha spoke quietly. "How substantial are we talking about?" Daniel Pike opened another folder and turned it toward her. Several pages listed financial holdings, equity positions in technology firms, commercial real estate investments, international funds, even ownership stakes in several venture capital partnerships. At the current market valuation, Pike said calmly, the estate's liquid and managed assets total approximately $200 million. The room went silent. Lily's eyes widened. Lucas leaned forward. 200 million, Pike nodded. Yes. Tabitha did not react the way many people might have. She didn't gasp. She didn't laugh. She simply studied the documents carefully. Years of archival work had trained her mind to absorb information before reacting to it. "What restrictions exist on the trust?" she asked. Pike seemed almost pleased by the question. "There are several." He pointed to a paragraph near the center of the page. "The assets remain under your personal control, but are legally protected from marital claims." Tabitha looked up. In other words, your husband cannot access them." Lucas glanced at his mother. "Dad doesn't get any of it," Pike answered gently. "The trust was structured specifically to prevent that." Tabitha continued reading. Another section outlined separate educational funds for Lucas and Lily. Full tuition coverage through graduate school. Additional investment accounts that would mature when they turned 25. She placed the document back on the table. "When does the transfer become active?" "Within 60 days, Pike said. "Most of the holdings are already in place. We simply need your signature on the trust administration documents." Tabitha nodded slowly. Pike leaned back slightly. "Your grandfather left a letter for you as well." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. Tabitha stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a single handwritten page. The handwriting was firm, but slightly uneven. "Tabitha, I know I have no right to ask forgiveness for the distance between us, but I have watched your life quietly, and I see the strength you carry. This inheritance is not meant to control you the way money controlled our family before. It is meant to give you freedom. Use it wisely. Protect your children. And remember that dignity is the only wealth that truly matters. Richard Langston." Tabitha folded the letter carefully. She placed it back in the envelope. Lucas studied her face. "Mom, yes, are we rich now?" Tabitha considered the question. "Money changes some things," she said softly, "but it doesn't change who we are." Daniel Pike closed the folders. "We'll finalize the paperwork today. After that, the trust administration team will begin transferring control." Tabitha nodded. Outside the tall windows, sunlight finally broke through the clouds over Boston Harbor. And hundreds of miles away in Westchester, Arthur Cunningham sat in his quiet house, unaware that the woman he had pushed out of his life had just become one of the wealthiest private individuals in the region. But the truth would not stay hidden for long, because wealth leaves a paper trail. And soon those papers would begin moving through the same legal channels that Arthur's own decisions had already set in motion. For now, however, Tabitha Cunningham simply signed her name at the bottom of the trust documents. Calm, precise, and entirely unaware of how dramatically that signature would reshape the future of everyone involved. While Tabitha Cunningham sat in a quiet law office overlooking Boston Harbor, Arthur Cunningham remained in the large colonial house in Westchester that still technically belonged to both of them. But the atmosphere inside the house had changed. The silence felt heavier now. At first, Arthur told himself the quiet was necessary. Recovery required calm. That was what Dr. Caldwell had said. Still, every room in the house carried reminders of something he could not quite grasp. Photographs remained on the walls. Children's drawings still hung on the refrigerator. A small pair of sneakers sat beside the back door, where Lily usually kicked them off after school. Arthur looked at these things without the emotional connection they were meant to carry. But something about their absence from the house, the children themselves, their voices, their small daily movements, left a strange, hollow feeling behind. Vanessa Whitmore filled that silence quickly. Over the past week, she had begun visiting the house almost every day. Sometimes she arrived with business documents, sometimes with takeout food from restaurants Arthur liked, sometimes simply to check on him. On the surface, it seemed helpful, practical. But slowly, her presence began reshaping the rhythm of the house. One afternoon, Arthur sat in his home office reviewing a series of development proposals when Vanessa entered carrying 2 coffees. "I figured you could use a break," she said, placing one beside him. Arthur leaned back in his chair. "Thanks." Vanessa glanced at the stack of files on his desk. "You're working too hard already. I'm trying to catch up." She sat across from him. "You know the board isn't expecting you to be fully operational yet." Arthur rubbed his forehead. If I step away too long, investors start worrying. Vanessa nodded sympathetically. Which is why we should protect your focus. Arthur looked at her. What do you mean? Vanessa hesitated just long enough to make her words sound thoughtful. I mean unnecessary distractions at home. Arthur understood immediately. You mean Tabitha? Vanessa lowered her voice. I'm just saying. Emotional stress can slow neurological recovery. Arthur exhaled slowly. That's what Dr. Caldwell warned about. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. You did the right thing asking for space. Arthur studied her expression. Did I? Vanessa didn't answer directly. Instead, she reached for one of the financial reports on the desk. Speaking of space, she said lightly, I noticed something odd in your household accounts. Arthur straightened. What kind of odd? Vanessa flipped the page toward him. Some of the joint accounts still list automatic transfers tied to your wife's name. Arthur frowned. I thought those were already handled. Some of them, Vanessa said carefully, but not all. Arthur looked annoyed. I don't want unnecessary complications right now. Vanessa nodded. Exactly? She tapped the page. If she's no longer living here, it might be wise to restructure access. Arthur considered the suggestion. It sounded logical, practical, and more importantly, it felt like something he could control while everything else in his life remained uncertain. What would that involve, he asked. Vanessa spoke calmly. Mostly administrative adjustments, restricting shared access to certain accounts until things are legally clarified. Arthur nodded slowly. Fine, let's start that process. Vanessa smiled faintly. I'll contact the bank. Across the state line in Massachusetts, Tabitha Cunningham finished the final paperwork inside the Henderson and Pike conference room. Daniel Pike organized the signed documents into neat folders. The trust administration team will begin transferring control of the assets within the next few weeks, he explained. Tabitha nodded. What immediate changes should I expect? Mostly financial notifications, Pike said. Investment managers, portfolio advisors, and several corporate boards will need confirmation of your authority. Lucas sat quietly in his chair, absorbing only fragments of the adult conversation. Lily whispered to him, Does this mean we can buy a castle? Lucas rolled his eyes. That's not how money works. Tabitha overheard them and smiled faintly. Pike slid another folder across the table. There's one more detail you should be aware of. Tabitha looked up. Your grandfather anticipated that your personal circumstances might become complicated. Tabitha raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Pike opened the folder. It includes legal recommendations from the estate advisors. Inside were documents outlining asset protection strategies, trust shielding, separate financial management structures, even suggested legal contacts for family law specialists. Tabitha read quietly for several minutes. Then she looked up. You expected this conversation to happen. Pike shrugged gently. Let's just say your grandfather believed financial independence often changes the dynamics of relationships. Tabitha didn't respond. She simply closed the folder. Thank you for the preparation. Pike stood. My assistant will finalize everything this afternoon. Tabitha shook his hand. Thank you, Mr. Pike. As she gathered her bag, Pike added one more comment. For what it's worth, Miss Cunningham, your grandfather seemed very confident in you. Tabitha paused briefly. I hope I don't disappoint him. I doubt that will be an issue. Later that afternoon, Tabitha drove the twins back toward New York. The sky had cleared completely now. Sunlight stretched across the highway as they crossed the state line. Lucas looked up from the back seat. Mom. Yes. Are we going back to the motel tonight for now? Lily tilted her head. Are we ever going back to the house? Tabitha kept her eyes on the road. I don't know. The answer was honest, and honesty, she had learned, was sometimes the only steady ground available. Back in Westchester, Arthur finished a call with the bank. Yes, he said into the phone. Restrict shared access for the time being. He listened for a moment. Yes, I understand there may be legal steps later. He hung up and leaned back in his chair. Vanessa watched him from the sofa. That should simplify things, she said. Arthur nodded. I just want clarity. Vanessa studied him carefully. You deserve that. Arthur looked toward the hallway. For a brief moment, he imagined the sound of Lucas running down the stairs. But the house remained quiet. He shook the thought away. It's temporary, he said. Vanessa followed his gaze. Yes, she said softly, of course. But as the afternoon sunlight faded across the empty rooms of the Cunningham house, the distance between Arthur's assumptions and the reality unfolding beyond his knowledge continued growing. Because somewhere inside, a legal database in Boston, newly filed trust documents had already begun circulating through financial institutions. Documents carrying the name Tabitha Cunningham, primary beneficiary. And once those records reached the wider network of banks, attorneys, and investment firms connected to Arthur Cunningham's professional world, the quiet story he believed he controlled would begin to look very different. But for the moment, Arthur remained unaware, sitting in his office, believing he had simplified his life, while the truth was only beginning to move. 3 days after returning from Boston, Tabitha Cunningham sat at the small wooden table inside the motel room while Lucas and Lily finished their homework on the beds. The motel had already begun to feel strangely normal. Lucas organized his school books carefully each evening, stacking them beside the lamp. Lily taped one of her drawings to the wall above her bed, a bright crayon picture of a tree with purple leaves. Children adjusted quickly when stability came from a person rather than a place. Tabitha's laptop glowed softly on the table as she reviewed several new emails. Most of them came from financial institutions connected to the Langston estate. Account confirmations, investment summaries, introductions from portfolio managers. The numbers attached to those messages were almost abstract in their scale. But Tabitha focused on something else. Legal structure, protection, clarity. That was why she had scheduled another meeting that afternoon. A name appeared in the email she had received earlier that morning. Naomi Pierce, family law attorney, Westchester County. Lucas looked up from his math worksheet. Are we going somewhere again today? Tabitha closed the laptop. Yes, where to meet someone who helps families solve complicated problems. Lily tilted her head. Like a counselor, more like someone who understands the law. Lucas nodded slowly. That sounds serious? It is. Naomi Pierce's office sat inside a renovated brick building just outside downtown White Plains. Unlike the towering corporate offices Tabitha had visited in Boston, this space felt more grounded. Bookshelves lined the walls. Large windows overlooked a quiet street. Behind a simple desk sat a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she noticed everything. Naomi Pierce stood when Tabitha entered. Miss Cunningham, thank you for meeting with me. Naomi shook her hand firmly. Please, call me Naomi. She glanced toward the twins. And you must be Lucas and Lily. They nodded politely. You're welcome to sit in the waiting room if you'd like. Naomi said gently. There are books and puzzles. The twins accepted immediately. Once the door closed behind them, Naomi returned to her desk. I reviewed the brief summary you sent in your email, she said. But I'd like to hear the full story. Tabitha sat across from her. She spoke calmly, clearly. Beginning with the accident, Arthur's memory loss, Vanessa Whitmore's growing influence. The moment Arthur asked her and the children to leave the house. Naomi listened without interrupting. When Tabitha finished, Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. And the inheritance, she asked. Tabitha slid a folder across the desk. Naomi opened it. Her eyebrows lifted slightly as she scanned the documents. Well, she said quietly, that changes the strategic landscape. Tabitha remained composed. My priority is my children. Naomi nodded. Of course. She tapped the folder. The trust structure here is extremely well designed. Your grandfather's advisors clearly anticipated potential complications. Naomi looked up again. Has your husband been informed about the inheritance yet? No. Does he know you've consulted legal counsel? No. Naomi considered that. That gives us an advantage. Tabitha didn't respond to the word advantage. She simply waited. Naomi leaned forward. Right now, the most important thing is documentation. Tabitha opened her bag and removed the leather notebook. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You already have some. Tabitha placed the notebook on the desk. I've been keeping records for years. Naomi opened it. Several pages were filled with dates, brief descriptions, and short quotations. Naomi read silently for a few moments. Then she looked up again. This is extremely helpful. Tabitha nodded. I also have emails, bank notifications, and digital copies of financial records. Naomi smiled slightly. You may have just made my job significantly easier. She turned to a new page in the notebook. Now we need to talk about the children. Tabitha's posture straightened. Lucas and Lily, yes. Naomi folded her hands. Your husband's request that you leave the house, did it include any discussion about custody arrangements? No, did he offer financial support for the children? Now, Naomi wrote something down. That's important. She paused. There's another question I need to ask. Tabitha waited. Did anyone record what happened when he asked you to leave? Tabitha hesitated. I didn't. Naomi nodded. That's all right. Then Tabitha added quietly, but someone else might have. Naomi looked up. What do you mean? Tabitha reached into her bag again and removed a small tablet. This belonged to Lucas. She tapped the screen and opened a file. When we were packing our bags that afternoon, the tablet was recording voice notes for one of his school projects. Naomi leaned forward, and Tabitha pressed play. The audio began with the sound of movement inside the house. Lucas's voice. Then Lily. Then Arthur. His tone clear, firm, cold. I don't know who you people are, and I don't want unnecessary stress in my home right now. The recording continued. Arthur's voice again. You'll have to find somewhere else to stay. Naomi listened carefully. When the recording ended, she leaned back slowly. That she said is extremely important evidence. Tabitha nodded once. I thought it might be. Naomi closed the tablet. With this recording, your notes and the financial documentation, we can establish a clear narrative. Tabitha looked at her. I'm not interested in destroying Arthur. Naomi studied her carefully. That's not how the legal system works anyway. She paused, but the law does care about protecting children. Tabitha nodded. That's what matters. Naomi closed the folder. Then our next step is straightforward. What is it? We begin formal proceedings. Tabitha absorbed the words calmly. What does that involve? Naomi stood and walked to the window. First, we file for temporary custody arrangements to stabilize the children's living situation. She turned back. Second, we request financial disclosures from Arthur Cunningham. Tabitha raised an eyebrow. Will that trigger questions about the trust, eventually? Naomi smiled faintly. And when it does, the balance of power in this situation will shift dramatically. Tabitha remained silent. Naomi returned to her desk. But for now, she said, we move carefully. That evening back at the motel, Lucas sat on the bed holding his tablet. Mom, yes, did that recording help? Tabitha sat beside him. Yes. Lucas looked relieved. I didn't even know it was recording. Tabitha placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Sometimes the truth records itself. Across town, inside the large Cunningham house, Arthur sat in his living room reviewing financial statements. Vanessa sat nearby, scrolling through her phone. Arthur frowned at the screen. That's strange. Vanessa looked up. What is one of the investment databases flagged a new trust account connected to the Langston estate? Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Langston. Arthur nodded. Apparently the primary beneficiary is someone named Tabitha Cunningham. Vanessa stared at him. For the first time since the accident, genuine surprise crossed her face. Arthur looked up slowly. What Vanessa didn't answer immediately because somewhere in the growing web of financial records and legal filings, the story Arthur believed he controlled had just taken a turn he never saw coming. Arthur Cunningham stared at the computer screen for several seconds after reading the name again. Primary beneficiary, Tabitha Cunningham. The line appeared inside a financial registry database that his firm occasionally accessed when reviewing large-scale investment structures connected to potential development partners. Normally, he would have ignored a record that had nothing to do with his current projects. But the surname caught his attention. Cunningham. He leaned closer to the screen. "This must be a coincidence," he muttered. Vanessa Whitmore stood up from the sofa and walked behind him. "What are you looking at?" Arthur turned the monitor slightly so she could see. "Some kind of trust tied to the Langston estate." Vanessa frowned. "Langston?" "As in Richard Langston," Arthur nodded. "That's what it says." Vanessa studied the entry more carefully. The numbers listed beneath the trust name were staggering. Equity positions, real estate holdings, investment funds, even a venture capital portfolio. Her breath slowed. "This is enormous." Arthur glanced at her. How enormous? Vanessa scrolled down the page. If these valuations are accurate, this trust controls well over $200 million. Arthur let out a short laugh. That can't be right. Vanessa didn't laugh. She was still staring at the beneficiary line. "Arthur." "What?" "Look at the name again." Arthur leaned closer. Tabitha Cunningham. For a moment, he simply sat there, his expression blank. Then he shook his head. "No." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Does your wife have family in Boston?" Arthur hesitated. Her grandfather was some kind of investor. Vanessa's eyes sharpened. Richard Langston was not some kind of investor. He was one of the earliest venture capital figures in New England. Arthur leaned back in his chair. "And you think Tabitha just inherited all that?" Vanessa didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened another window and searched the estate filings database. Several legal notices appeared immediately. Probate filings, trust confirmations, beneficiary documents, all filed within the last few days. Vanessa turned the screen toward Arthur. "Look." Arthur scanned the documents. Each one confirmed the same name. Tabitha Cunningham, primary beneficiary. Arthur felt something tighten in his chest. That's not possible. Vanessa studied him carefully. Did she ever mention being close to her grandfather? Did she ever say she might inherit something like this? Arthur shook his head slowly. She never talked about money. Vanessa leaned against the desk. That's interesting. Arthur frowned. Why Vanessa didn't answer immediately? Because a different thought had just formed in her mind. A very practical thought. $200 million changed the entire equation. Arthur noticed her silence. What? Vanessa smiled faintly. Well, if this information is accurate, your wife is about to become one of the wealthiest individuals in this region. Arthur didn't respond. Instead, he stared at the screen again. Memories still refused to fill the empty spaces in his mind. But logic began assembling a picture. Tabitha, the quiet woman who had left the house with 2 suitcases, the woman he had told to find somewhere else to live, now connected to a trust larger than most real estate portfolios he had spent years negotiating. Arthur rubbed his forehead. This doesn't make sense. Vanessa tilted her head. It makes perfect sense. Arthur looked up. What do you mean? Vanessa spoke carefully. It means you may have underestimated your wife. Across town, Tabitha Cunningham sat inside Naomi Pierce's office once again. The twins waited in the reception area with coloring books, while Naomi reviewed a series of financial disclosures on her computer. These are your husband's current holdings, Naomi said. Tabitha studied the documents. Commercial real estate projects, corporate partnerships, investment properties. Arthur had built an impressive portfolio. But compared to the Langston estate, the scale was very different. Naomi tapped the screen. He's already begun restricting access to joint accounts. Tabitha nodded. I expected that. Naomi leaned back. The problem is that doing so while you and the children were forced out of the house creates legal complications for him. Tabitha folded her hands. Explain. Naomi spoke calmly. Family courts take financial responsibility for children very seriously. If we establish that he removed you from the primary residence without providing proper support, it strengthens your position significantly. Tabitha nodded slowly. And the trust? Naomi smiled slightly. That part is almost unbelievable. Tabitha raised an eyebrow. Why? Because the trust changes the strategic balance completely. Naomi turned the monitor toward her. With this level of financial independence, you are not negotiating from a position of vulnerability. Tabitha didn't react to the word independence. She simply read the documents. Naomi watched her for a moment. You're taking this remarkably calmly. Tabitha looked up. I've had a week to think. And money doesn't solve the real problem. Naomi nodded. That's true. She paused. But it does prevent other people from using money as leverage against you. Tabitha closed the folder. Good. Naomi folded her hands again. There's something else you should know. What these estate filings are public record. Tabitha understood immediately. You mean Arthur can see them? Naomi nodded. If he hasn't already. Back at the Cunningham house, Arthur stood near the kitchen window, holding his phone. Vanessa sat at the table watching him. You should call her, she said. Arthur looked uneasy. I don't even know what I would say. Vanessa shrugged. Start with congratulations. Arthur exhaled slowly. This feels strange. Vanessa leaned forward. Arthur, this kind of wealth changes everything. Arthur looked at her. How? Vanessa gave him a measured smile. It changes how people treat each other. Arthur considered that. Are you suggesting I should reconcile? Vanessa tilted her head slightly. I'm suggesting you should understand the situation before making any permanent decisions. Arthur stared at the floor. For weeks, he had believed the structure of his life was simple. Recovery, work, distance from complications. Now that structure suddenly looked fragile. $200 million had a way of rearranging priorities. Vanessa stood and walked toward the window beside him. You might want to speak to her before lawyers do, she said quietly. Arthur nodded slowly, but something about the suggestion made him uneasy. Because even without his memories, he understood one thing clearly. The woman he had told to leave his house had just gained more power than he had ever imagined. And somewhere inside that realization, another question began forming. Not about money, but about the past. Because if Tabitha had lived for years with the knowledge of a family fortune she never used, never mentioned, never relied upon, then perhaps the quiet woman he thought he understood had been someone very different all along. Arthur looked down at his phone. Tabitha's contact name still sat in the call list. He stared at it for a long time, but he didn't press the button. Not yet. The news did not arrive with drama. There was no dramatic announcement, no headline splashed across a screen inside the Cunningham house. Instead, the truth moved quietly through the channels where money and law usually traveled: databases, legal registries, financial alerts. By the end of the week, 3 different investment firms connected to Arthur Cunningham's professional network had already seen the same name. Tabitha Cunningham, primary beneficiary, Langston Family Trust. People in Arthur's industry paid attention to names attached to numbers like that. Questions began circulating quietly. Arthur noticed the shift first during a phone call with one of his longtime partners. Arthur said Michael Grant, a senior investor who had worked with him on several development projects in Manhattan. I didn't realize you had a connection to the Langston estate. Arthur frowned. What connection? A pause followed on the line. You're serious? Yes. Michael hesitated. I assumed you knew. Arthur's voice hardened slightly. Knew what? Michael cleared his throat. The probate filings out of Boston? Arthur said nothing. Your wife, Michael continued carefully. She inherited the majority of Richard Langston's estate. Arthur leaned back slowly in his chair. Yes, he said. I've recently become aware of that. Michael gave a short laugh. Well, congratulations. That kind of capital opens interesting opportunities. Arthur didn't respond immediately, because the word opportunities sounded very different in his ears. Maybe, he said finally. They ended the call a few minutes later. Arthur remained at his desk, staring at the dark screen of his phone. For the first time since the accident, uncertainty began creeping into his sense of control. Across the room, Vanessa Whitmore watched him quietly. That was Michael Grant, wasn't it? She asked. Arthur nodded, and he already knew. Vanessa gave a small, knowing smile. Of course he did. Arthur rubbed the bridge of his nose. I feel like I'm the last person to understand what's happening. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. That's because the information is moving through financial networks. Arthur looked up. You mean everyone in my industry knows, probably. Arthur exhaled slowly, and Tabitha hasn't said a word. Vanessa studied him carefully. That's interesting, isn't it? Arthur frowned. What do you mean? Vanessa walked toward the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water. I mean, most people who suddenly inherit $200 million would make sure everyone knew. Arthur thought about that. Tabitha had never been the kind of person who chased attention. Still, the silence felt deliberate. Maybe she hasn't had time, he said. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Or maybe she's waiting. For what? Vanessa met his eyes. For the right moment. Arthur didn't like the way that sounded, because somewhere inside him, the realization was beginning to form that Tabitha might understand this situation far more clearly than he did. Across town, Tabitha Cunningham sat at a small table inside a quiet cafe near Naomi Pierce's office. The twins were at school for the first time in a week, temporarily enrolled through arrangements Naomi had helped coordinate. For the first time since leaving the house, Tabitha had a few uninterrupted hours to think. Naomi placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. Your husband knows, she said. Tabitha didn't seem surprised. I assumed he would. Naomi sat down. These filings move fast in financial circles. Tabitha stirred her coffee slowly. Has he contacted you? Naomi watched her for a moment. You expected that Tabitha nodded. If Arthur were comfortable with uncertainty, he wouldn't have asked us to leave. Naomi smiled slightly. That's a very accurate psychological assessment. She opened a folder on the table. We're preparing the temporary custody request today. Tabitha glanced at the documents. Will that trigger a response? Almost certainly. Naomi folded her hands. Once the court becomes involved, your husband will have to participate in the process. Tabitha nodded slowly. And Vanessa Naomi raised an eyebrow. You think she'll involve herself? Tabitha considered the question. She already has? Naomi leaned back. I've seen situations like this before, meaning third parties who believe they understand the dynamics of a marriage. Tabitha gave a faint smile. And they usually don't. Naomi shook her head. They rarely do. She slid another document across the table. There's one more development you should be aware of. Tabitha read the heading. Notice of Financial Disclosure Request. Arthur will receive this within 48 hours, Naomi explained. Tabitha looked up, and after that, his legal counsel will contact us. Tabitha closed the folder. Good. Naomi studied her expression. You're not angry. Tabitha looked out the cafe window toward the quiet street. Anger wastes energy. Naomi nodded slowly. Your grandfather might have liked you. Tabitha smiled faintly. He wrote something similar in his letter. Later that afternoon, Lucas and Lily walked out of their new school together. The building looked unfamiliar, but the routine of classrooms and homework had already begun restoring a sense of normalcy. Lily skipped slightly as they crossed the sidewalk. Do you think Dad knows yet? She asked. Lucas shrugged. Probably. Lily kicked a pebble along the pavement. Do you think he'll call? Lucas thought about it for a moment. I don't know. What would you say if he did? Lucas didn't answer right away. Finally, he said quietly, "I'd ask why he didn't want us before." Lily didn't respond, because children often understand the most painful questions instinctively. That evening, inside the Cunningham house, Arthur finally made a decision. He picked up his phone. Vanessa watched from the opposite side of the room. "You're calling her?" Arthur nodded. "I need to understand what's happening." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "And what if she doesn't answer?" Arthur looked down at the screen. "She will." He pressed the call button. Across town, Tabitha's phone vibrated on the motel table. She glanced at the screen. Arthur, Cunningham, Lucas, and Lily sat nearby, watching television. Tabitha looked at the phone for several seconds before answering. "Hello?" Arthur's voice came through the line, careful and controlled. "Tabitha, yes." A pause. "I think we need to talk." Tabitha listened quietly. Outside the motel window, evening traffic moved steadily along the road. "Yes," she said, "I believe we do." And somewhere between the quiet motel room and the silent house Arthur still occupied alone, the next phase of their story had finally begun. The call between Arthur and Tabitha lasted less than 3 minutes. Arthur spoke carefully, as if every word had been rehearsed before he dialed. "I think we should meet," he said. Tabitha did not ask why. She already knew. Arthur hesitated before continuing. "There are things we need to discuss." Tabitha's voice remained calm. "Yes." Arthur glanced across the living room where Vanessa sat quietly pretending to scroll through her phone. "Tomorrow," he added, "somewhere neutral." Tabitha thought for a moment. "There's a cafe near the courthouse in White Plains." Arthur nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Fine." The call ended. Arthur lowered the phone slowly. Vanessa looked up. Well, she agreed to meet. Vanessa leaned back against the sofa. That was easier than I expected. Arthur frowned. "What did you expect?" Vanessa shrugged. A woman who just inherited $200 million might not be in a hurry to return phone calls. Arthur didn't answer, because part of him had been thinking the same thing. The next morning arrived with cold, pale sunlight stretching across the streets of White Plains. Tabitha arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. She chose a table near the window where she could see both the street and the entrance. Old habits of observation had never left her. A few minutes later, Naomi Pierce walked in and joined her. "You're early," Naomi said. "So are you." Naomi set her briefcase on the table. "You're sure you want me here?" "Yes." Naomi nodded. "That's wise." They didn't talk much after that. Both women simply waited. At exactly 10 o'clock, Arthur Cunningham walked through the cafe door. Vanessa Whitmore followed 2 steps behind him. Tabitha noticed that immediately. So did Naomi. Arthur spotted Tabitha at the table and approached slowly. For a moment he looked uncertain, as if the simple act of sitting across from his wife had become unfamiliar territory. "Tabitha?" he said. "Arthur." His eyes flickered toward Naomi. "And you are Naomi Pierce," she replied calmly, "Miss Cunningham's attorney." Arthur blinked. That was fast. Naomi offered a small, polite smile. "Preparation saves time." Vanessa pulled out a chair beside Arthur. "And I'm Vanessa Whitmore," she added, "Arthur's colleague." Naomi nodded slightly, but did not introduce herself again. A waitress came by briefly to take drink orders. The moment she left, Arthur leaned forward. "I assume you know why I wanted to meet." Tabitha looked at him calmly. "Yes." Arthur folded his hands. "You inherited your grandfather's estate?" "Yes." Arthur exhaled slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tabitha's answer came without hesitation. "Because you asked me to leave." The words were not spoken with anger, but they carried weight. Arthur glanced down at the table. "I was recovering from a brain injury. I understand that." "And I didn't remember," Tabitha interrupted gently. "You remembered enough to decide the children and I didn't belong in the house." Vanessa shifted slightly in her seat. "That's not entirely fair," she said. Naomi finally spoke. "Miss Whitmore, unless you are a legal representative in this matter, I suggest you allow the parties directly involved to speak." Vanessa stiffened, but said nothing. Arthur rubbed his temples. This situation is complicated. Tabitha nodded. Yes. Arthur looked at her carefully. You could have told me about the inheritance before leaving. Tabitha tilted her head slightly. And what would have changed? Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it again. The question lingered between them. Naomi opened her briefcase and slid a folder across the table. This is the official filing for temporary custody arrangements, she said. Arthur looked at the document. You're filing for custody for stability, Naomi replied calmly. Arthur's jaw tightened. I never said I didn't want my children. Naomi nodded. But you did remove them from their primary residence without providing alternative housing or financial support. Vanessa leaned forward. Arthur needed space for his recovery. Naomi glanced at her, and the children needed a place to sleep. The tension at the table thickened. Arthur turned back to Tabitha. I wasn't thinking clearly. Tabitha studied his face. That part might have been true, but it did not erase what had happened. Arthur looked down at the custody papers again. You're taking this to court, if necessary, Naomi said. Arthur sighed. I don't want a public fight. Tabitha finally spoke again. Neither do I. Arthur looked up. Then what do you want? Tabitha answered quietly. For Lucas and Lily to have stability. Arthur nodded slowly. And me? Tabitha considered the question carefully. You need time to understand what kind of father you want to be. Arthur's shoulders dropped slightly. Vanessa looked frustrated. This is turning into something much bigger than it needs to be, she said. Naomi raised an eyebrow. On the contrary. She reached into her briefcase again. This conversation is actually very simple. She placed a small tablet on the table. Arthur frowned. What's that evidence? Naomi tapped the screen. A recording began playing. Arthur's own voice filled the quiet cafe. I don't know who you people are, and I don't want unnecessary stress in my home right now. Arthur froze. The recording continued. You'll have to find somewhere else to stay. Vanessa's eyes widened. Arthur stared at the tablet as if hearing a stranger speak. When the recording ended, the silence at the table felt heavy. That was recorded the afternoon you asked your family to leave, Naomi said calmly. Arthur swallowed. I didn't realize that the children were present, Naomi finished. Arthur looked down. No. Vanessa leaned forward quickly. He had a brain injury. Naomi nodded. Yes. Then she added quietly, but the law still protects children. Arthur ran a hand through his hair. This is a disaster, Tabitha spoke gently. It doesn't have to be. Arthur looked up. What do you mean? Tabitha met his eyes. You can choose what happens next. Arthur sat silently for several seconds. Outside the cafe window, people walked past without noticing the quiet legal battle unfolding inside. Finally, suddenly, Arthur spoke. What would you suggest? Tabitha's answer came slowly. Start by acting like their father. Arthur nodded. For the first time since the accident, something close to genuine regret appeared in his expression. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, clearly unhappy with the direction the conversation had taken. Naomi closed the tablet and returned it to her briefcase. We'll wait for your attorney to contact us, she said. Arthur stood slowly. I think I need time to process this. Tabitha nodded. You've had some. Arthur didn't argue. He simply turned and walked toward the cafe door. Vanessa followed him. Outside on the sidewalk, Arthur stopped walking. That recording. Vanessa crossed her arms. He wasn't thinking clearly. Arthur looked at her. No. He exhaled slowly. But I was still the one who said it. And for the first time since the accident, the version of the story Vanessa had been quietly building inside Arthur's mind began to crack. The cafe conversation lingered in Arthur Cunningham's mind long after he and Vanessa left White Plains. He drove home in silence. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat, watching the road ahead through the windshield, as afternoon traffic moved steadily north toward Westchester. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Arthur's thoughts circled around one thing: his own voice. The recording Naomi Pierce had played inside the cafe had sounded unmistakable. Calm, controlled, and cold. "You'll have to find somewhere else to stay." The words echoed in his memory. Vanessa finally broke the silence. "You shouldn't let that recording get to you." Arthur kept his eyes on the road. "I told my children to leave their home. You were injured." Arthur shook his head slightly. "That may explain it. It doesn't erase it." Vanessa crossed her arms. "The court will understand that." Arthur did not answer, because for the first time since the accident, he felt something beyond confusion: responsibility. Later that afternoon, Arthur sat alone in his office. The house felt different again. Not quiet, but heavy. He opened his laptop and began searching through old files: family photographs, school events, holiday videos, moments from a life he could not remember living. In one video, Lucas and Lily ran across the backyard, chasing each other with water balloons, while Arthur's voice laughed in the background. Arthur watched the screen carefully. That man in the video looked relaxed, connected, present. The person he saw in the footage did not resemble the man who had stood in the doorway weeks earlier telling his family to leave. Arthur leaned back slowly. "Who was I?" he murmured. Across town, Tabitha Cunningham sat in Naomi Pierce's office, reviewing the next phase of legal documents. Naomi closed a folder and leaned back. "The meeting today went better than I expected." Tabitha raised an eyebrow. "Did it?" Naomi nodded. "Your husband showed signs of recognizing his responsibility." Tabitha remained neutral. "That doesn't guarantee anything." No, Naomi agreed. "But it suggests he's beginning to understand the consequences of his actions." Tabitha glanced toward the window. "I'm not interested in punishing him." Naomi studied her carefully. "That may be true." She paused. "But the legal system still requires clarity." Tabitha nodded. "I understand." Naomi slid another document across the desk. "This is the next stage of the custody process." Tabitha read quietly. "Scheduled depositions, financial disclosures, witness statements, and the recording," she asked. Naomi tapped the folder. "It will be submitted as supporting evidence if necessary." Tabitha closed the document. "What about Vanessa Whitmore?" Naomi's expression sharpened slightly. "She may become relevant." "In what way, if her involvement influenced your husband's decisions?" Tabitha considered that. "I don't want unnecessary conflict." Naomi gave a small smile. Conflict rarely asks permission. 2 days later, the first formal depositions began. The setting was less dramatic than most people imagine. A quiet conference room, a long table, several legal representatives, a court reporter recording every word. Arthur arrived first with his attorney Gregory Salter, a senior partner from a Manhattan law firm specializing in corporate and family litigation. Gregory adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the case file. "This situation is unusual," he said quietly to Arthur. Arthur nodded. "I'm aware." Gregory flipped to the page containing the audio transcript. "You understand this recording will carry significant weight." Arthur stared at the document. "Yes." Gregory leaned forward. "Your medical records confirm the brain injury." Arthur looked up, but Gregory hesitated. "But the recording suggests you were capable of making deliberate decisions." Arthur sighed. "I was." Gregory closed the folder. "In that case, our best strategy is cooperation." Arthur nodded slowly. "I agree." Across the table, Naomi Pierce organized her notes as Tabitha entered the room. The two women exchanged a quiet glance. Tabitha sat down without speaking. The court reporter adjusted her equipment. The deposition began. Gregory Salter spoke first. "Mr. Cunningham, please state your full name for the record." "Arthur James Cunningham." "And you understand that you are under oath?" "Yes," Gregory continued. "Mr. Cunningham, do you recall the afternoon when your wife and children left the family residence?" Arthur hesitated. Yes. Gregory glanced at the transcript. And you asked them to leave? Yes. Why, Arthur took a breath. I believed their presence created stress that could interfere with my medical recovery. Naomi spoke for the first time. Mr. Cunningham, were you aware that your children had nowhere else arranged to stay that night? Arthur looked down briefly. No. Naomi leaned forward slightly. Did you ask? Arthur's voice softened. No. The court reporter's keys tapped steadily. Naomi continued. Mr. Cunningham, were you aware that your colleague Vanessa Whitmore was present during that conversation? Yes. And had she discussed your marriage with you prior to that moment? Arthur hesitated again. Yes. Gregory raised a hand slightly. Objection. Relevance. Naomi responded calmly. Question relates to influence on the defendant's decision-making. The court reporter continued typing. Arthur answered quietly. Yes. Naomi nodded once. No further questions on that point. Later that afternoon, Vanessa Whitmore sat in the same chair across the table. Her posture remained confident. But the room felt different now. Naomi began calmly. Miss Whitmore, how long have you known Arthur Cunningham? Approximately 4 years. And during that time, did you discuss his marriage with him? Vanessa smiled politely. Occasionally. Naomi opened a printed email. This message was sent from your account 6 weeks before the accident. She read aloud. Arthur deserves a partner who understands his ambitions. Vanessa's smile tightened. That was taken out of context. Naomi placed the email on the table. What context would you prefer? Vanessa crossed her arms. I was speaking about professional pressure. Naomi nodded. And advising him about personal relationships, Vanessa didn't respond immediately. The silence lasted just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Naomi continued. Miss Whitmore, were you present when Mr. Cunningham asked his wife and children to leave the home? Yes. And did you attempt to intervene? Vanessa hesitated. No. Naomi wrote a note. Thank you. By the end of the day, the transcripts filled nearly 200 pages. Every sentence, every pause, every hesitation. When the session ended, Arthur stepped outside the building and stood on the sidewalk for several minutes. The air felt colder than it had that morning. Across the street, Tabitha exited the building with Naomi. Lucas and Lily waited near the car. Arthur watched quietly as the twins ran toward their mother. Lucas hugged her first. Then Lily wrapped both arms around her waist. Tabitha smiled and bent down to speak to them. Arthur felt something shift inside his chest. A quiet recognition. Not a memory, but something close. Naomi noticed him watching. Your husband is beginning to understand, she said quietly. Tabitha followed her gaze. Arthur stood alone across the street, silent, watching his children. Tabitha didn't wave. She didn't call out. She simply placed a hand on each child's shoulder and guided them toward the car, because some realizations required distance to fully form. And Arthur Cunningham still had one more truth left to face. The legal process moved forward the way most serious legal processes do, quietly, methodically, and without dramatic spectacle. There were no shouting matches in courtrooms. No emotional confrontations under bright lights. Instead, there were documents, statements, financial disclosures, expert opinions, and the slow accumulation of facts that eventually shaped a decision no one in the room could ignore. 3 weeks after the depositions, the parties gathered again in a hearing room at the Westchester County Family Court building. The room itself was smaller than most people imagined when they thought about courtrooms. Wood-paneled walls, a raised bench, 2 long tables facing forward. Judge Eleanor Harding presided over the case. She was known for her calm demeanor and for asking very direct questions when necessary. Arthur sat beside his attorney, Gregory Salter. Across the room, Tabitha sat next to Naomi Pierce. Lucas and Lily were not present. Naomi had insisted on that. Children should never feel like they're part of a legal battle, she had explained earlier. Arthur noticed their absence immediately. The judge reviewed the file in front of her. Mr. and Mrs. Cunningham, she said this matter concerns temporary custody arrangements and financial support for 2 minor children. Her voice was calm but firm. I have reviewed the depositions, the financial disclosures, and the submitted evidence. She looked toward Arthur. Mr. Cunningham, do you dispute that you asked your wife and children to leave the family residence on April 29th? Arthur spoke quietly. No, Your Honor. And do you dispute that they had no alternative housing arranged at that time? Arthur hesitated briefly. No. Judge Harding nodded once. The court acknowledges that you suffered a documented brain injury shortly before that event. Arthur felt a small measure of relief. But the judge continued. However, the responsibility of a parent toward minor children remains unchanged regardless of personal circumstances. Arthur lowered his gaze. Naomi Pierce spoke next. Your Honor, our request is straightforward. She placed a folder on the table. We ask that primary physical custody remain with Miss Cunningham, while Mr. Cunningham completes medical recovery and demonstrates stable parenting capacity. Judge Harding flipped through the documents. And financial support, Naomi nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Temporary support consistent with Mr. Cunningham's income and financial disclosures. Gregory Salter stood. Your Honor, my client fully acknowledges his responsibility toward his children. Judge Harding looked at Arthur. Is that correct, Mr. Cunningham? Arthur straightened slightly. Yes, Gregory continued. Mr. Cunningham also requests structured visitation, so he may rebuild his relationship with Lucas and Lily during his recovery. The judge considered that. That seems reasonable. She turned to Tabitha. Mrs. Cunningham, do you object to structured visitation? Tabitha spoke calmly. No, Your Honor. Judge Harding nodded again. Then she paused and glanced at another document in the file. The court is also aware of the recently established Langston Family Trust. Arthur felt the room grow slightly quieter. Judge Harding looked directly at Tabitha. Mrs. Cunningham, the trust appears to place you in control of significant independent financial assets. Yes, Your Honor. And those assets are legally separate from marital property. That is correct. Judge Harding closed the file. In that case, the court's decision will focus solely on the well-being of the children and the responsibilities of both parents. Arthur understood the meaning behind those words. Tabitha's inheritance would not be used against her, nor would it excuse him from supporting his own children. Judge Harding folded her hands. The court orders the following. She spoke slowly, clearly. Primary residential custody of Lucas and Lily Cunningham will remain with their mother, Tabitha Cunningham. Arthur listened quietly. Mr. Cunningham will have structured visitation twice weekly under family counseling supervision until further evaluation of his medical recovery. Arthur nodded. That is acceptable, the judge continued. Mr. Cunningham will also provide financial support according to the provisional schedule outlined in the financial disclosures. Gregory Salter leaned forward slightly. We accept the court's ruling. Judge Harding looked at both parties one final time. This arrangement may be revisited after 6 months. She paused. In the meantime, I strongly encourage both parents to focus on cooperation rather than conflict. The gavel tapped softly. The hearing ended. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon air carried the first hint of autumn. Arthur stood on the steps for several minutes after the session ended. Gregory Salter placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. This outcome could have been far worse, the attorney said. Arthur nodded slowly. I know. Gregory glanced toward the parking area where Tabitha stood with Naomi. You should take the opportunity to rebuild things with your children. Arthur looked across the lot. Tabitha stood beside her car, speaking quietly with Naomi. She looked exactly the same as she always had, calm, composed, unmoved by the legal victory she had just secured. Arthur exhaled slowly. I intend to. Gregory nodded and walked away. Naomi Pierce closed her briefcase beside Tabitha. That went as well as we hoped. Tabitha looked toward the courthouse steps where Arthur still stood. Yes. Naomi studied her expression. You're not celebrating. Tabitha gave a faint smile. This wasn't a competition. Naomi nodded. Fair enough. Lucas and Lily waited in the back seat of the car. When Tabitha opened the door, Lily leaned forward. Is it over? Tabitha buckled her seatbelt. For now. Lucas looked past her toward the courthouse. Did Dad come? Yes. Lucas hesitated. Did he say anything about us? Tabitha started the engine. He asked for time with you, but Lily looked curious. Do you think he means it? Tabitha glanced at them in the rearview mirror. I think he's beginning to understand. Arthur remained on the courthouse steps until he saw Tabitha's car drive away. For a moment, he considered walking over earlier, saying something, anything. But he hadn't known what the right words would be. And for once, Arthur Cunningham understood that speaking too quickly had already cost him more than he could easily repair. He turned and walked down the steps slowly. Across the street, Vanessa Whitmore stood beside her car. She had attended the hearing quietly, but had not entered the courtroom. Arthur approached. Well, she asked. It's done. Vanessa crossed her arms, and Arthur looked toward the empty street where Tabitha's car had disappeared. The court gave Tabitha primary custody. Vanessa frowned. That's unfortunate. Arthur shook his head. No. He spoke more firmly now. It's appropriate. Vanessa looked surprised. Arthur met her gaze calmly. I asked my family to leave their home. Vanessa said nothing. Arthur continued. I'm going to focus on rebuilding my relationship with my children. Vanessa studied him carefully. And your marriage? Arthur thought about that question for several seconds. Then he answered honestly. I don't know. For the first time since the accident, Arthur Cunningham stopped trying to control the outcome. And in that quiet acceptance, something closer to accountability finally began to take shape. Autumn arrived slowly in Westchester County. The trees along the quiet streets began shifting from deep green to gold and red, and cooler air settled into the evenings. The rhythm of life returned to something steadier, though not exactly the same as before. 3 months had passed since the court hearing. For Tabitha Cunningham, the most important changes were not the financial ones. The Langston Trust had completed its administrative transfer weeks earlier. Portfolio managers called regularly. Investment advisors proposed strategies. Banks opened private client accounts that once would have been unimaginable. But Tabitha kept most of that world at a distance. The first major decision she made was surprisingly simple. She left the motel, not for a mansion, not for the kind of house someone might expect a person with $200 million to buy. Instead, she purchased a quiet property outside the town of Rye. The house was modest compared to the estates nearby. 2 stories, a wide backyard shaded by old maple trees, a short walk to the elementary school Lucas and Lily now attended. The twins liked it immediately. Lucas claimed the bedroom facing the backyard so he could watch the birds that gathered near the trees each morning. Lily filled her room with drawings books and a growing collection of potted plants she insisted on caring for herself. The house felt peaceful, safe, and most importantly, it belonged to them. Tabitha structured the purchase through a trust advisor Naomi had recommended. The property was legally separate from the rest of the estate, shielded from any future disputes. But the house itself never felt like a financial asset. It felt like a reset. Arthur Cunningham's life moved more slowly during those same months. The court's structured visitation plan required him to attend weekly family counseling sessions before spending extended time with Lucas and Lily. At first, the meetings were awkward. The twins spoke carefully. Arthur often struggled to find the right words. Dr. Caldwell, who had agreed to oversee the sessions alongside a child therapist, observed the interactions quietly. Memory had not returned. But something else had begun replacing the empty spaces. Awareness. Arthur listened more than he spoke. He asked questions. He apologized, not dramatically, just honestly. One afternoon, after a counseling session, Lucas surprised him with a question. Dad, Arthur looked up. Yes, Lucas hesitated. Do you remember anything yet? Arthur thought about the answer carefully. No. Lucas nodded slowly. Okay. Arthur watched him for a moment. But I remember something else he added. But Arthur's voice softened. That you're my son. Lucas didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. And for the first time since the accident, the distance between them felt slightly smaller. Vanessa Whitmore gradually disappeared from Arthur's daily life. The shift happened quietly. After the legal proceedings began, Arthur's business partners grew cautious about maintaining professional distance from the controversy surrounding his personal situation. Vanessa remained employed by the consulting firm, but her presence around Arthur's projects diminished. The last time Arthur spoke to her in person happened outside his office building one evening. Vanessa stood beside her car. You're really walking away from all of it? She asked. Arthur looked puzzled. Walking away from what? The opportunity? Arthur shook his head slightly. My priority is my children. Vanessa studied him. You're different now. Arthur considered that, maybe. Vanessa gave a small shrug. Well, good luck, Arthur. Then she got into her car and drove away. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument, just distance. And sometimes, distance was enough. On a quiet Saturday morning in late October, Tabitha stood in the backyard of the new house while Lucas and Lily raked fallen leaves into a large pile near the fence. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. Inside the house, a stack of unopened financial reports sat on the kitchen counter. Tabitha would review them later. But not today. Today belonged to the children. Lily jumped into the leaf pile with a laugh. Lucas followed a second later. Tabitha watched them for a moment before sitting down on the wooden bench near the porch. A black leather notebook rested beside her. The same notebook she had carried for years. She opened it slowly. The earlier pages still contained the entries from the weeks after the accident. Dates, conversations, moments she had once feared might define the rest of her life. She turned the page and wrote a new entry, October 18th. Lucas and Lily laughing in the backyard. First real autumn in the new house. She paused, then added one more line. Peace feels different than victory. Tabitha closed the notebook. Later that afternoon, Arthur arrived for his scheduled visit. Lucas ran toward the driveway when he saw the car. Dad. Arthur stepped out and smiled faintly. Hey. Lily followed more slowly, but hugged him when he reached the porch. Arthur glanced around the yard. This place is nice. Tabitha stood near the doorway. Thank you. Arthur nodded. I'm glad they have space to play. The moment felt calm, not tense, but not overly familiar either. Arthur turned toward Tabitha. I wanted to say something. She waited. I know I've apologized before. Tabitha didn't interrupt. But I'm still learning what that apology actually means. Tabitha studied him carefully. That's honest. Arthur nodded. I don't expect anything from you. Good. Arthur smiled slightly at that. But I wanted you to know I'm trying. Tabitha held his gaze for a moment. I see that. Lucas ran past them carrying a football. Dad, come on. Arthur looked back at the yard. I should go. He stepped outside. Lucas threw the ball toward him. Arthur caught it. The motion felt natural, simple, something a father and son had probably done many times before, even if he couldn't remember it. Tabitha watched from the doorway as Arthur jogged across the yard with the children. For the first time since the accident, the past no longer felt like something she needed to defend herself from, because the future had already begun building itself in quieter ways. And sometimes dignity didn't come from winning a battle. Sometimes it came from walking away with your values intact and letting the truth speak for itself. In the end, this story was never really about money. $200 million might sound like the center of the story. It certainly changed the balance of power, and it revealed things that had been hidden beneath the surface for years. But the real turning point came much earlier. It happened the moment Tabitha Cunningham chose silence instead of humiliation. The moment she chose documentation instead of anger. The moment she chose stability for her children instead of a fight for pride. Because life has a quiet way of revealing character when circumstances strip away everything else. Arthur Cunningham lost his memory in a single violent moment on a rainy highway. But what followed forced him to confront something deeper than forgotten details. It forced him to see the consequences of decisions made without empathy. And slowly, piece by piece, he began learning what responsibility actually looked like. Not in courtrooms, not in bank records, but in the small moments that build trust again. A father throwing a football in the backyard. A child asking careful questions. A family rebuilding something that once seemed broken. As for Tabitha, the inheritance from her grandfather gave her freedom. Not the loud kind of freedom people imagine when they think about wealth, but the quiet kind. The kind that allows a person to protect their children, choose their own path, and walk away from places where respect no longer lives. If this story stayed with you, and take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Stories like this travel far, and it's always fascinating to see how many different places they reach. And if you believe that dignity, patience, and quiet strength still matter in today's world, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories ahead. Stories about choices, consequences, and the quiet ways people rebuild their lives.